The story follows a 1,000-year-old vampire and a beautiful blind girl, Milan, who falls in love with him. Milan is blind but has extraordinary hearing, allowing her to detect sounds that normal humans cannot. Her father, ashamed of her blindness and worried she won't carry on his legacy, has had children with other women, which angers Milan's mother. The story begins on the day of a celebration for Milan's newborn half-brother, the child of her father's 8th wife. At the event, we meet Mr. Shen, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in town. He owns a respected newspaper agency but is surrounded by strange rumors, including one that he waters his plants with blood instead of water. While using her heightened hearing, Milan overhears a man named Li and his associates plotting to kill Mr. Shen to stop him from publishing negative stories about them. During the celebration, Milan's father proudly introduces his new wife and son to the guests, while Milan's mother, furious over her husband's actions, takes out her anger on Milan, blaming her for being blind. Mr. Shen hears Milan being beaten and, unable to ignore her cries, steps outside, pretending to smoke. He intervenes to save Milan by distracting her mother. Meanwhile, Li becomes impatient when Shen leaves without addressing him. Furious, he orders his men to kill Shen. Later that night, as Shen walks home after finding his car sabotaged, a car tries to run him down. The attackers then shoot him in the head, but to their shock, Shen survives and angrily demands to know who sent them. Unfazed, the attackers continue their assault, unaware that Shen is a vampire. Although Shen eventually collapses from blood loss, his attackers run him over multiple times to ensure he is dead. Guixing reports back to Li, claiming that Shen was finally killed. However, Li is baffled by the report, especially since Shen managed to kill 2 of the attackers and survive a headshot before collapsing. But what Li doesn't know is that Shen is far from an ordinary human who can be killed so easily. Soon, Li learns from his men that the police found no bodies at the crime scene. Furious and confused, he begins to realize Shen might not be dead after all. Meanwhile, Milan, fed up with her mother's abuse and feeling hopeless, decides to escape her family once and for all, sneaks out of the mansion to end her life somewhere far away. She stumbles upon an old, abandoned building where she plans to end her misery. However, inside, she hears a weak voice. It turns out Shen, gravely injured, has been hiding there. When she moves closer, Shen senses her approach and urgently warns her to stay away. But Milan, not listening, moves forward and accidentally falls onto him. Shen notices she is blind, but his dire situation forces him to ask for her help. He begs her to find his friend, Situ William, at Keats Hospital. Milan hesitates, explaining that her blindness makes her useless and that she has no will to live. However, Shen's desperation and the fact that someone finally needs her for the first time in her life changes her mind. Before she leaves, Milan gives Shen her coat to keep him warm. In return, Shen asks for her name. Feeling a faint sense of purpose, Milan sets out to find Situ William. While searching for Keats Hospital, Milan crosses paths with Li. He notices her bruises and asks for her name. Upon learning she is Milan, the daughter of Mr. Mi, he is shocked to see the extent of her injuries. Pretending to be a kind stranger, Li offers to escort her home safely. Milan, unable to mention Shen, reluctantly agrees. Back at the mansion, Milan becomes increasingly worried about Shen. As she washes her hands, still covered in his blood, she unknowingly splashes some of it onto her face. To her astonishment, her blindness is cured instantly. However, she decides to keep this miracle a secret, even from her maid. The next morning, determined to fulfill her promise to Shen, Milan ventures out again and reaches Keats Hospital. There, she finds Situ William, but he is busy dealing with an unruly patient. Desperate to speak with him, Milan waits for a chance to approach and deliver Shen's urgent message. As soon as Situ William hears about a girl looking for him, he heads to his office and meets Milan. She urgently informs him about Shen's critical condition and begs him to save him. Situ calmly promises to help, but his composed demeanor worries Milan. Fearing for Shen's safety and suspicious of Situ's quick attempts to send her away, Milan memorizes his scent to identify him later if he fails to keep his word. Before leaving, she warns him not to betray her trust. Later that night, Situ secretly leaves the hospital and arrives at the abandoned building where Shen is hiding. He takes Shen back to his house and begins treating his injuries in an effort to save his life. Meanwhile, Officer Li grows increasingly anxious as his men fail to locate Shen's body. Convinced Shen may still be alive, Li orders his men to search the entire town and assigns others to keep watch over the Mi mansion, suspecting a connection. The next morning, Milan listens to a weather broadcast on the radio and worries that Shen might have frozen to death. Her thoughts are interrupted by her mother, who discovers that Milan sneaked out the previous night and lashes out at her in anger. Despite her mother's abuse, Milan's main concern remains Shin, who has yet to recover from his injuries. As Situ waits anxiously, Shin finally wakes from his deep sleep. Meanwhile, Lee and his men intensify their search for Shin, combing the town for any sign of him. That night, Shin visits Milan outside her window. Seeing him alive but still injured, Milan is deeply concerned for his well-being and urges him to take care of himself. Shin reassures her, saying that because she saved him, she now owns half his life. He promises to protect her from her bullies and gives her a flower pot containing a plant that blooms even in winter, asking her to care for it. With a snap of his fingers, he vanishes into thin air, leaving Milan touched by his gesture and their newfound friendship. A week later, Shin and Situ return to Shin's house, only to find Lee's men waiting for him. Seeing Shin alive and well, the men leave and report back to Lee. During this time, Situ notices that Shin can no longer tolerate regular human food. Shin realizes his body is beginning to crave blood, a hunger that will soon spiral out of control. Determined to find a cure, Shin devises a plan to locate his brother, the one who turned him into a vampire, hoping he holds the key to reversing the curse. Lee, furious after learning Shin is alive and unharmed, lashes out at his junior officers for failing to eliminate him. Amid his frustration, he receives a call from Miss Jean, a wealthy and confident woman who knew Lee when he worked at her family's mansion as a child. Miss Jean, having fallen for Lee, insists he accompany her to a dance party. Reluctantly, Lee agrees. At the party, Miss Jean quickly notices Lee's forced smiles and distant demeanor, which only excites her further. Determined, she pulls him onto the dance floor. However, Lee becomes distracted when he spots Shin at the party, appearing completely healthy and mingling with the crowd. Preoccupied, Lee keeps stepping on Miss Jin's feet before abruptly leaving the dance to follow Shin. Upstairs, Shin seems to have been waiting for Lee. Lee is stunned to see him fully recovered, with no trace of injuries from their previous encounter. Shin brushes off Lee's curiosity, claiming he was simply lucky. As they sit together, Lee pretends to admire Shin, calling himself a fan and requesting a private dinner the next evening to discuss things further. Shin, without hesitation, agrees to the meeting. Meanwhile, Situ and Miss Jean share a dance at the party. The two quickly bond, and their growing connection adds a layer of intrigue to the night. Back at the Mi mansion, the flower Shin gifted to Milan has fully bloomed. However, Milan's mother, unhappy with her daughter's independent actions, angrily destroys the plant. Milan, enraged and heartbroken, retaliates for the first time, forcing her mother out of her room. Desperate, she tries to save the damaged plant, but the flower has already been ruined, leaving her in tears. In her frustration, Milan impulsively begins cutting her hair, symbolizing her rebellion against her mother, who often pulled her hair to assert control. The following night, Shin meets Lee at the agreed-upon restaurant. Lee is surprised by Shin's confidence in showing up alone, without bodyguards. During the meal, Lee tries to charm Shin, insisting that his organization targets only the wealthy and never harms the poor. He even offers Shin a generous reward to ensure his newspaper doesn't expose them. Shin, amused by Lee's clumsy attempt, accepts the offer, but on one condition. He demands Lee's life in return. This unexpected demand triggers Lee, but before he can act, Shin makes it clear that he is far too powerful for Lee or his men to harm. Shin's real motive is revenge for the suffering Lee caused him. Suddenly, Superintendent Chi arrives at the restaurant, spotting Shin and Lee together. Shin, seizing the opportunity, takes Lee hostage to make his escape. Despite Chi and his officers pursuing him, Shin easily outmaneuvers them and disappears into the night. Meanwhile, back at the Mi mansion, Milan is locked in her room and starving due to her mother's cruelty. Weak and hopeless, she collapses on the floor. That same night, Shin arrives at the mansion, claiming he wants to thank Milan for saving his life. Her mother, refusing to believe Milan could have helped anyone, lies and says Milan isn't home. However, Shin's heightened senses pick up Milan's faint breathing and heartbeat. Hearing her collapse, he rushes inside, finding her unconscious on the floor. Shin quickly wraps Milan in a blanket and carries her out of the mansion, taking her to Keats Hospital for urgent care. His actions set the stage for a deeper bond between them while further entwining their fates. When Milan wakes up, she is relieved to see that she is with Shin. She gently checks his forehead to see if he has fully healed, feeling comforted by his presence. However, her joy is clouded by sadness as she apologizes for failing to keep the flowers he gifted her alive. Shin reassures her, promising to bring her another one, but Milan hesitates, expressing fear that her mother might destroy it too. Noticing her short hair, Shin asks if her mother cut it. Milan admits she cut it herself to prevent her mother from pulling her hair again. From that day onward, Shin visits Milan daily, spending time with her as she gradually regains her strength. Their bond deepens with every passing day. Meanwhile, Lee is also recovering in the hospital from his injuries. Miss Jean visits him and, upon seeing his condition, advises him to leave his dangerous work and start a business instead. She even offers to help him financially. However, Lee stubbornly refuses, unwilling to change his ways. The next day, Lee's Jr. informs him that Shin was recently seen at the Mi mansion and later carrying Milan to Keith's hospital. Just as he processes this information, Miss Jean shows up again, much to his annoyance. Jean is puzzled by Lee's growing distance from her but refuses to give up because she genuinely cares for him. After leaving the hospital, Jean confronts Guixing, Lee's subordinate, scolding him for not properly looking after Lee. Guixing apologizes and vows to do better. Meanwhile, Lee, desperate to escape Miss Jin's persistent visits, insists on being discharged from the hospital. Guixing helps him leave, taking him to Lee's place instead, as Lee cannot bear to see Jean every day. Shin, on the other hand, grows more determined to find his evil brother, who has been terrorizing innocent people. He sets a trap to lure his brother out. When his brother finally appears, a fierce confrontation ensues. However, before Shin can capture him, his brother escapes, vanishing into the shadows. The next morning, Miss Jean visits the hospital again, only to find that Lee has already been discharged. Upset, she goes to his small house, but it is locked. Heartbroken by the thought that Lee hates her so much, she heads to a fancy restaurant to distract herself. There, she encounters Situ, who is pretending to be blind. His act intrigues Jean, and he successfully wins her attention. Meanwhile, Milan has fully recovered and begins exploring the area around her room. Shin notices her eating snow and asks why. Milan replies that she doesn't want to return home, and eating snow might make her sick again, hinting at her reluctance to leave Shin's care. Shin reminds her of his promise to protect her until he saves her life completely. Unbeknownst to them, someone takes a photograph of their moment together. Elsewhere, Jean walks home with Situ after their encounter. As they talk, she shares the story of the man she loves, Lee. She reminisces about how Lee worked for her father as a child and how she used to tease him playfully. However, Lee would often avoid her because her father would beat him for interacting with her. Jean reveals a pivotal moment when her house caught fire. Despite the danger, it was Lee who bravely ran inside and saved her life, cementing her feelings for him. Situ listens attentively, his curiosity about Jean and her connection to Lee growing. Lee becomes increasingly concerned about Shin's connection to Milan but eventually realizes that Shin isn't in love with her. He simply feels indebted to her for saving his life. The next morning, as Shin meets with Situ to discuss Milan's discharge, he recalls the first time Situ saw him drinking blood. Curious, Shin asks why Situ wasn't scared. Situ dodges the question, claiming he's not easily frightened. Outside the hospital, Lee spots Milan alone and attempts to speak with her, but Shin arrives just in time to interrupt his potentially sinister intentions. Shin questions how Milan knows Lee, and she explains that he was the one who brought her home that fateful night. Now aware that Lee was involved in the attempt to kill Shin, Milan vows to protect Shin from Lee. When Shin and Milan return to the Mi mansion, Shin confronts Mrs. Mi. He calmly advises her to be a better mother to Milan and warns that if she harms Milan again, he will expose the family's scandals and affairs. Furious, Mrs. Mi tries to attack Milan, but Milan defends herself and bars her mother from entering her room. The next day, Milan gets ready to meet Shin, further angering her mother. However, Mrs. Mi refrains from harming her in Shin's presence. Shin takes Milan to a school, hoping she'll meet people her age and feel less isolated. Meanwhile, Lee meets with Superintendent Chi to discuss Shin. He points out Shin's lack of bodyguards or relatives, raising suspicions about his true identity. Later, Lee approaches Milan at her new school, asking her to help him make peace with Shin. Milan agrees but oddly asks Lee if she looks pretty. Lee responds that she reminds him of his late sister, who was very beautiful. When Milan delivers Lee's message to Shin, Shin becomes suspicious of Lee's intentions, worrying that Lee might later exploit Milan if he realizes her importance to Shin. To demonstrate his authority, Shin visits Lee at the police station with his men. Situ questions why Shin doesn't use his vampire powers to handle Lee, but Shin explains that he must use human methods to deal with humans. During their conversation, Lee invites Shin inside for a talk. Lee admits he asked Milan for help because he thought Shin would listen to her, considering she had saved him. This strikes a nerve with Shin, who insists it was he who saved Milan. However, Lee has already pieced together that Milan helped Shin the night of the attack. He bluntly asks how Shin survived such fatal injuries and recovered so quickly. Shin, unfazed, warns Lee not to interfere with him or Milan. He openly admits to being a monster who feeds on people and threatens to devour Lee if he tries to harm them again. Later that night, Shin visits Milan to check on her. She pleads with him to stop leaving her alone, saying she feels lonely without him. Shin reassures her that he's working to resolve her problems so she can have a better life. When Milan touches his face and notices he's wearing a mask, Shin reluctantly removes it. Though his appearance might frighten others, Milan, being blind, remains unbothered. Afterward, Shin sneaks into Mrs. Mi's room, pretending to be an ancestral spirit of the Mi family. He warns her of divine punishment if she continues to torment Milan. Terrified, Mrs. Mi becomes paranoid and loses her grip on reality. A maid assigns a bodyguard to watch over her, but that same night, Mrs. Mi seduces the bodyguard in her growing hysteria. A few days later, Guixing informs Lee that Shin hasn't visited Milan at her house recently and that Milan herself hasn't ventured out. This leads Lee to believe that Shin and Milan's connection isn't as strong as he initially thought. Meanwhile, Situ visits Milan on Shin's behalf and learns that Mrs. Mi has run away from the mansion. The news brings relief to Milan, who finally feels a sense of freedom. Returning home after the confrontation, Situ finds Shin repairing his old clocks, a habit that helps him think. However, Situ can't shake his concern over how long Shin intends to look after Milan, fearing she may eventually fall in love with him. Shin dismisses this idea, claiming he's far too old for her. Meanwhile, Lee, while coercing a poor landowner to hand over his property, devises a plan to arrest Shin on a fabricated charge to investigate his true identity. Shin, respecting the law, allows himself to be arrested and remains calm while in custody. However, when Lee visits him, Shin warns of severe retaliation once he is released. Noticing that Shin refuses the food provided in jail, Lee grows suspicious and brings in an injured man, hoping to provoke Shin into revealing his true nature. Shin, however, becomes furious at Lee's tactics, stating that his earlier claim of being a monster was merely to scare him. Lee's actions only deepen Shin's anger. Worried, Milan goes to Keith's hospital to seek Situ's help in freeing Shin. Situ, busy with a surgery, assures her that Shin is the most upright man in the town and will be released soon. However, his casual mention that all Shin truly needs is blood sparks Milan's curiosity. Upon returning home, Milan finds her father, who has returned briefly before leaving for the south. Meanwhile, protests erupt from Shin's newspaper agency and his supporters, demanding his release. Lee, seeing an opportunity, orders Guixing to infiltrate the protests and cause chaos. Situ, recognizing Shin's declining health, pleads with Miss Jean to intervene. Miss Jean agrees reluctantly but grows furious upon learning that Lee accused Shin of assaulting him, which led to the arrest. The situation takes a turn when Chief Lin receives a call from the commissioner demanding Shin's immediate release due to insufficient evidence. Despite this, Lee refuses to release Shin, determined to uncover his secret. Milan unexpectedly arrives at the station, claiming she wants to file a report. Both Lee and Shin are taken aback when she tearfully accuses Shin of violating her on the night she left her home. However, since she is blind, she requests to touch Shin's face to confirm his identity. Seeing an opportunity to strengthen the case against Shin, Lee agrees and allows her to approach him. However, as Lee becomes distracted by the press, Milan cleverly bites her lip and kisses Shin, transferring her blood to him. Shin, revitalized, regains his strength, and Milan declares that it wasn't Shin who harmed her. Superintendent Chi then arrives, ordering Shin's immediate release. Shin leaves the station with Milan, vowing revenge on Lee. At home, Shin commends Milan's cleverness but questions how she knew he needed blood. She explains that Situ had let it slip, and she devised the risky plan to save him. Grateful but exhausted, Shin suddenly collapses. Situ arrives in time to reassure Milan that Shin's condition is normal and that he'll recover after rest. Milan stays by Shin's side as he sleeps for 3 days. Upon waking, Shin finds Milan exploring his home. When he takes a cold bath to rejuvenate, Milan accidentally walks in. Shin remains silent, and she quietly leaves after some time. Meanwhile, Lee is visited by Miss Jean at his modest home. Feeling guilty for yelling at her at the police station, he apologizes. Jean forgives him but insists he never bark at her again. She offers him dumplings, remarking on his poor living conditions, and suggests he return to her mansion as a servant, promising it will benefit him more. Lee, insulted, loses his temper. He admits that while he has always been seen as a lackey, he values his dignity above money. He firmly refuses her offer and asks her to leave him alone. Later, Sidhu visits Milan and, curious about her devotion to Shin, asks if she's seeking financial support from him, just as he does. Milan denies this, stating she wants something else entirely from Shin, though she doesn't elaborate further. As if she has fallen in love with Shin. Later, Sidhu teases Shin by reading aloud a newspaper article about Milan kissing him at the police station, hinting at a potential love affair. Shin, however, brushes it off, asserting that he doesn't see Milan that way. Shin then heads to his news agency with Milan and meets his manager. Though he is initially angry that his employees participated in the protest, he rewards them with a bonus to show his gratitude. However, Shin's anger flares again when he sees the article about him and Milan. While Shin clarifies that the kiss was only to save his life, Milan seems unbothered by the speculation about their relationship. Meanwhile, a mysterious woman named Miss Mu arrives in town, meeting with Superintendent Chi to discuss Shin, who Chi claims possesses extraordinary powers. Miss Mu hints that she has a secret weapon to deal with Shin, if necessary. Shin, suspicious of Miss Mu's intentions, investigates her. During a private conversation with Sidhu, he reveals he noticed a strange change in Milan's pupils when she gave him her blood, suggesting that contact with his blood might have affected her eyes. To test this, they mix a small amount of Shin's blood into milk and give it to Milan. Although she can sense the blood, she drinks it, and moments later, she briefly regains her sight. A visit to an eye doctor confirms that Milan's blindness cannot be cured by conventional means. Only Shin's blood has the potential to restore her vision. Meanwhile, Lee and Miss Mu form an alliance to capture Shin. During a dinner with Miss Mu, Lee overhears some men making vulgar comments about Miss Jean. Despite his enmity with her, Lee cannot tolerate their remarks and teaches them a lesson, earning Miss Jin's fleeting respect. Shin uncovers more about Miss Mu. Her family worships a mysterious stone that brought them immense success, but all successors die before the age of 30. With only 2 years left to live, Miss Mu is desperately searching for a solution. While sneaking into her house to investigate, Shin discovers the stone, but before he can uncover its secrets, he is forced to flee as Miss Mu arrives. To protect Milan from becoming a target, Shin devises a plan. Pretending to sever ties with her, he dramatically kicks her out of his house, convincing the spies watching that their connection is over. Milan reluctantly agrees to the charade, returning to Mi Mansion under Shin's orders. When Lee learns that Shin has left town, he and Superintendent Chi grow frustrated. Meanwhile, Shin visits an astrologer, Mr. Mo, to seek guidance on dealing with Miss Mu. Mr. Mo, who knows much about supernatural forces, agrees to help. Back at Mi Mansion, Lee confronts Milan, demanding information about Shin's whereabouts. Milan refuses, but her maid accidentally reveals that Shin will return for her soon. Lee decides to wait at Mi Mansion for Shin. That same night, Shin arrives at Mi Mansion to find Milan imprisoned in a cage. Furious but cautious for her safety, he hands himself to their custody. Miss Mu and Lee interrogate Shin while Milan, imprisoned in her mansion, cleverly escapes but is quickly recaptured. She demands to speak with Lee. When Lee learns of this, he meets with Milan. Milan pleads for Shin's release, claiming he is everything to her. However, Lee dismisses her plea, bound by orders from his superiors. Days of torture fail to break Shin's resolve, frustrating Miss Mu. At night, Shin finally escapes, killing several guards. However, as he attempts to flee, Miss Mu uses her stone's power to subdue him, capturing him once again. Doctors examining Shin are baffled by his body's complete lack of wounds. When Shin regains consciousness, he is humiliated by Lee, who forces him to beg for clothes. During the interrogation, Shin recounts his tragic past. His father married a mysterious woman who bore Shin a half-brother. Shin's grandmother, suspicious of his mother and brother, saw them drinking blood and branded them as monsters. As she was about to burn Shin's mother and half-brother alive, in a desperate bid to save her son, Shin's mother killed the entire family, leaving Shin as the sole survivor. Hearing this, Lee expresses no sympathy, claiming Shin deserves all the misfortune he's endured. When Shin questions Lee's hatred toward him, Lee abruptly leaves, unsettled by memories of the first time he met Shin. In a flashback, it is revealed that Lee once sought Shin's help to save his gravely ill sister when he was a teenager. But Shin failed to help her. Lee's grief and anger turned into a deep-seated hatred for him. Now, Lee's vendetta against Shin is driven by a complex mixture of personal loss and his role in the unfolding conflict with Miss Mu. Miss Mu decides to meet Shin in person to perform a detailed examination of him. She uses advanced technology, including X-rays, but the results reveal nothing unusual about his body. Meanwhile, it's Miss Jin's birthday. Lee secretly buys her a thoughtful gift but, knowing their complicated relationship, hesitates to deliver it himself. Instead, he sends it through his junior officer, but Miss Jean refuses to accept it unless Lee delivers it personally. Lee, torn between his pride and emotions, decides not to show up. Later, Situ visits Miss Jin's house unaware it's her birthday. After realizing his oversight, he awkwardly excuses himself to head home. However, Lee and his men intercept and abduct him, using him as leverage against Shin. Lee forces Shun to board a train bound for the capital, taking both Milan and Situ as hostages to ensure Shin complies. During the train ride, Lee reveals Shun's dark past to Milan, hoping to turn her against him. However, Milan remains steadfast, refusing to believe Shin is a bad person despite Lee's accusations. As tension mounts, Shin proposes a poker game to pass the time, inviting Lee, Situ, and Miss Mu to join. During the game, Shin subtly glances at Miss Mu's ring, prompting her to nonchalantly reveal that it contains a 10,000-year-old meteorite shard. The game carries on through the night, during which Shun discreetly hints to Situ about a different train, the Asia Express, arriving at the next station. Situ relays this to Milan, who anxiously awaits Shin's plan. Later, Shun has a one-on-one conversation with Lee. Despite their antagonistic relationship, Shun expresses admiration for Lee's sense of justice and even offers him a bribe of 1 million to let him and his companions go. Lee rejects the offer, but he is deeply conflicted, especially as he remembers Shin being kind to him during his troubled teenage years. As the passengers sleep, Shin orchestrates an escape. He sneaks off with Milan and Situ, but Miss Mu spots them and alerts the guards. A chaotic chase ensues. Shin deals with the soldiers while ensuring Milan and Situ's safety. The pursuit continues on foot, with Lee and his men closing in. Exhausted and cornered, Situ is struck by a bullet. Just as hope seems lost, Situ unexpectedly rises and displays superhuman strength, effortlessly taking down the soldiers. Shin is shocked and demands answers. Situ reluctantly reveals that he is Shun's half-brother. Shin, overwhelmed by this revelation, begins to lose control of his emotions. Situ, sensing danger, pleads with Shun to stay calm and focus on escaping for now. This is the end of Part 1. Please comment and subscribe for Part 2.